So this presentation has been brought to you with more than a few tech issues and with unmedicated ADHD. And so in terms of forecasting, we're going to jump between topics a lot. And before this quest is over, there will also more than likely be the sensation of a sleepy full. And it won't necessarily be entirely clear how the threads join up. This is an invitation to a butterfingered reaching at something that appears to modulate its very nature in response to being focused on. And that's not actually just courtesy of this thing that's been captured in popular imagination as ADHD. This mode of perception is also a property of the conceptualization of addiction and of the many intersecting relationships between the ways we consume media and the ways we relatedly consume drugs. And this multiplicity of uncalibratable attributes is equally also a property of dragons. So essentially, we're doomed. Chasing the dragon, joy chasing long dragon in the original Cantonese. We're going to zero in on the imagery of this in a moment. But first, I would like to tell you about the dragon in this picture, an old friend. This is a dragon that I had the opportunity to encounter on the shore of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala in 2021. I had noticed a place simply labelled The Dragon in English in Google Maps, and I was in a seeking frame of mind and was eventually rewarded for all of the brambles that I traversed through with this absolutely resplendent entity. This is an instance of pyreolexy, which was a word that went straight into my lexical jewellery box when I heard it. And we're all more familiar with it than we think. It's the use of literal expressions as opposed to figurative. So that was me completely literally chasing the dragon before we get any deeper into any metaphors and their ripples through language and their effects on culture. Dr. Rhiannon Crane and I discussed this a lot in the semantics sessions. We had a conversation with the natural philosopher Hannah Close, where she described becoming switched on to metaphors as going through what she called metaphor satori, which is a really beautiful conceptualization of becoming alive to how many metaphors there are just in the atmosphere as we move through normal waking consciousness. But it's also a state of mind that has a flip side. And Rhiannon and I have definitely found that focusing on language and how it alters perception can leave you feeling so marinaded in metaphor that sometimes going to the fundamentals, to the etymology, to the, oh wow, that really does at its root just mean that, can feel revolutionary. Addiction, what we are dedicated to. And it's always worth noticing that there are sometimes things which are contained in speech which are just quite simply happening. So, Guatemala, a landscape apparently rich in literature.
Can I interrupt?
Could you
we
share
we can't see the slides. They're not being shared. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, goodness, that was what the kerfuffle before was meant to lead to. I'm so sorry. Can you see that now?
Great, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Do you want to see the last one?
That'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, so that's the very beginning. That's the dragon I met in Guatemala when I was literally chasing the dragon. That is kyriolexy, which is a word we're going to keep coming back to. It's when you're just quite literally, without metaphor, doing the thing in reality. And now here we are on the shores of Lake Atitlan again, in a landscape which is apparently rich in literalism, but actually quite famous for its metaphors. And very close to my chiriolexical dragon is Cerro de Oro, Hill of Gold, which, as you can see here, lends its shape to this drawing from The Little Prince. The author, the pilot, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, putatively took off, and by the way, I'm very open to being corrected on pronunciation of anything I say in this, so please add any pronunciation corrections that you notice coming up at the end. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry putatively took off from Guatemala before the sudden landing that inspired this allegory. I showed my masterpiece to the grown-ups and asked them whether the drawing frightened them, but they answered, "Frighten? Why would anyone be frightened by a hat?" My drawing was not a picture of a hat, it was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. But since grown-ups were not able to understand it, I made another drawing. I drew the inside of a boa constrictor so that the grown-ups could see it clearly. They always needed to have things explained. What does this comment on the nature of seeing or of how we read into things? Perhaps something about how prone we are to matching shapes we know with narratives we know, about our predictability, about how atypical it becomes to exercise our imagination once we stop being used to doing this in terms of what we choose to read into. There's a wonderful perspective on seeing in The Little Prince, which is very aligned with Wheaty and with Iboga. And now here is my secret, a very simple secret. It's only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. And now to somewhat less literally chase the dragon. Now, whether you can see the slides or not, you won't be able to see this one. This particular element of the talk is invisible to the naked eye because it would have cost me 349 quid to get the licensing from Getty Images to show you this 7-second video demonstrating what chasing the dragon means in the original drugs context, which is Hong Kong in the 1930s, where the metaphor was born. So I'm going to have to ask you, in the spirit of The Little Prince, to use your imagination. And the thing I really hope to demonstrate here is that because we're talking about something specific, if you don't conceptualize it right, that means it's not the thing and it doesn't happen. And what we're focusing on in this formation of chasing the dragon is a technique. So we need a shared understanding. Otherwise, when we say chasing the dragon, much like ego death or transcendent experience, which have come into popular culture from scientific discourse, we're just saying some words. So imagine that in your dominant hand, you're holding a lighter, and in your other hand, you have a sheet of foil. And on that sheet of foil, you have a tarry brown powder. It's all kind of globular, it's in the middle. In your pocket, you have a tube, which is also made of foil, and you're about to place it tight between your lips. So hold it carefully, and now, as you concentrate carefully on the foil in front of you and you take the lighter, firmly with your dominant hand, hold it under the foil sheet, and you're going to heat the heroin. And as it starts sliding across the sheet, you need to be picturing this, you tilt it away from you just a little bit, but not too much. And as it goes, and this is the bit that I really, really encourage you to imagine. It emits a vapor. You've got to be very careful in a very measured way to suck in the vapor, moving the drip of liquid as it travels across the sheet, meticulously continuing to heat it from underneath, but not too much, so that it continues to produce this undulating steam. Steam that looks, as it forms, in segments, somewhat like a dragon. And as you carefully let it slide, not so much that it burns up, let's notice all together now that this particular technique we've all been visualizing together is literally what gives rise to the metaphor chasing the dragon. The first time I encountered this phrase was in this guise as a metaphor directly applied to the technique, used functionally in a memoir called Wasted by Use a Voice founder Mark Johnson. Use a Voice is a charity that empowers people who use drugs in prison. I was 11 years old and I was chasing the dragon. But very often, chasing the dragon is used much more metaphorically, meaning to chase the sensation of the very first time you experienced an altered state of consciousness through your subsequent encounters with that substance. In An Instinct for Dragons, anthropologist David E. Jones refers to the dragon puzzle and dragon problem. Every culture around the world conceptualizes dragons somewhat differently, with possible different bases in the kinds of apex predators that proto-humans might have seen, feeding into the evolution of how we look at dragons. Sound like addiction? Which are conceptualized with a full range of emotions from veneration to terror all around the world. And something similar really can be considered for altered states of consciousness in different cultures, encountered in different ways over millennia and millennia of years, and especially the related entity of addiction. It's a collectively wrought concept being puzzled into existence through a multiplicity of vernaculars that relate to potentially unshared, inherently subjective experiences, and it's shifting with the times, but not everyone is in on the updates. Once it was conceptualized as a disease, as a means of destigmatizing, now this perspective is in many contexts being reappraised as restigmatizing. I'm thinking particularly of Maya Salowitz's brilliant book, The Unbroken Brain. And it doesn't help that, like chasing the dragon, there are many overused and understood, no longer specialized terms that pervade the discourse. Withdrawal, recovery. On this last one, in the context of the Iboga Church that I write for, we recently started questioning the term recovery because the compulsive coping strategy itself that someone might be shedding can be seen itself as a kind of cover, a protective blanket that no longer necessarily needs to be reached for or burrowed under. Perhaps recovery can mean taking off the cover. Now, this Eagles lyric at the bottom, Hotel California, it seems to fit with the idea that addiction, or a definition of what this experience is something you can keep seeking, keep trying to define, but you're not going to get there. It's also a tribute to a band called Steely Dan in celebration of how they left their lyrics open to interpretation. And also very much in this spirit. This is a book by Dr. John Buchanan, and I read this when I'd just broken a lot of patterns. And it's especially brilliant for the jouissance with which prior psychedelic experience and psychedelically flavored thinking make possible his strands of philosophical analysis, which stand strong in any mindscape. Concepts you don't need to fractalize it again in order to actualize. In true Whiteheadian style, this is a book which is an invitation to the perception of processes where before it may have seemed like there were just rigid entities, and also an invitation to constant questioning. And I think there's a lot to be said in the spirit of this book for bringing the ingenuity of previous psychedelic experiences to how we engage with media in the present moment, rather than necessarily microdosing and engaging with media directly in a neuroplastic state where clinical research keeps on indicating we might be more suggestible and more agreeable. And there's one particular anecdote in John Buchanan's book that feels really appropriate to bring up in relation to the idea of media. About a holiday he went on many years ago with a family who had a philosophically minded son called Mark. And the father of the family was woken up delightedly by his son. He'd just experienced a volte-face in his line of philosophical inquiry, and instead of calling out, "What's the answer? What's the answer?" he was overjoyed to have come to the conclusion that it would be better to call out, "What's the question?" So overjoyed that he woke his entire family up in the middle of the night to tell them. It's well worth approaching all media for the questions it begs and not necessarily for the answers that it purportedly gives. Being aware of the Bwiti tradition and Iboga, that it's possible to have an infinitesimal seeming sense of the interconnectedness of the systems that we participate in and engage with in relation to our physiologies, our psyches, our processing of past experiences, it's very hard to also hold this, at the same time, a remembrance of how determinedly Western medical systems tend to isolate the topic of so-termed addiction, and their terminology is key to how they do this. So according to clinical psychologist Dr. Weifeng Zhang of Anaya, it's unusual and difficult currently to get a combined diagnosis of a mental health condition and an addiction. Evaluations are geared to qualifying people most strongly for one diagnosis in particular over others, and then treating them for that. And it's only since 2013 that the DSM-5 has included compulsive behaviours that don't involve substances under its umbrella of addictions. Key examples being gambling, internet gaming, shopping, and sex. And the average global internet user spends 6 hours, 35 minutes online per day in 2024. Is this a behavioural addiction, or is this now what we just think of as a behaviour? The images behind Weifang are of the Collins School Dictionary and its smaller baby version. I looked at them in W.H. Smith yesterday, and the more expansive version doesn't mention drugs. And then on the right, you have the gem. And when there's just room for one idea, addict, a person who is unable to stop taking drugs, that's when addiction and drugs are immediately synonymized. A real cynic would point out the link between drug addiction treatment industries and the stereotype of dragons hoarding treasure. A lot of the struggle for shared specific understandings of words appears to relate directly to our overuse of some of the same words and then to having separate subjective definitions for them. This is a really brilliant book about this phenomenon, Plastic Words, The Tyranny of a Modular Language, by the linguistic philosopher Uwe Polkson. So transcendental, we've touched on this as a concept that ricochets between transpersonal psychology, where it's a specialized term, and inexpert claims on retreat websites promising a transcendental experience to people who don't know what that means in psychology. This is plastic language, the ability to borrow from specialized lexicons to connote expertise without necessarily needing to acquire it, and always to talk to people under the presumption that they haven't acquired it. Now, the thing about Lego, and it was seeing an information plaque for Lego in the Deutsche Museum in Munich that inspired the book, but it's actually called Plastic Water, Plastic Words, because the term Lego was ironically copyrighted at the time. The thing about Lego is that it's a closed system. Like Apple, there's nowhere else to go. And if no one else has the vernacular, the communication devices, if no one else can get charged up on what you're saying because they don't know what you mean, when it comes to the more original words you learn, you'll have no ports to plug them into. No current, no currency. Philosopher Sinead Murphy describes plastic language as having a vampiric quality to it, sucking the life out of more nuanced, truly specialized words which fall out of use. And then you end up with sentences like, the progress in strategies of communication supports development. Did I really say anything there? It sounds like words you might say in quite a variety of some contexts or other. Murphy writes a lot about social networks eroding our instinctive receptivity to individualized forms of social interaction. And plastic language is, of course, a very useful building block for this. So some Duplo in psychedelia: accelerate your personal growth, catalyze your potential for change. 10 years of therapy in one night. The last one is a Cardio-Lexical Guardian headline from 20 years ago that helped popularize Ibogaine. A total reset for the brain and body, a full-on mystical experience. Ancient well-being modalities. Could this just be every retreat website ever? The internet is friendly to plastic language, and it's also the home of latent semantic keywords. This kind of aggregation of the same words used again and again and again is a product of digital content. You don't get it in really, really old newspapers found under the floorboards of your friend's house, which is what these are. As search terms get used more and more, they rank higher and they get seen more and they get used more. It's a vicious cycle. And all of it is geared towards promoting and increasing homogeneity of perspectives and ways of expressing them, and predictabilities in our moods and our behaviors, the drugs we might want to take because they've been directly advertised to us, all because of how we feel when we engage in the advertisements. And these following taglines are really interesting to consider in relation to the ways that the Wheaty tradition encourages you to question, in relation to your own personal perceptions, what you can never really know. Giving you the facts, CNN. The New York Times seeks the truth and helps people understand the world. And now we have a shift into more than just facts. All the news, entertainment, and more is in the Chicago Defender. Whether it's Chicago news or national stories, the Chicago Defender has you covered in their thoughts. The BBC News informs, educates, and entertains, whatever you are, whatever your age. These last two do something really interesting. They present it like there's nowhere else you need to go. There's this terrifying inescapability. There's no need to read anything else, and this is the exact thing you need to read to know what's going on. But the last two also swell in this idea that it's where you go for your entertainment. And what they don't tell you is that the same storytelling techniques are used to tell you the facts as to entertain you, and they bleed freely between these two ostensibly demarcated boundaries. Because if we weren't entertained, we wouldn't absorb facts. Terence McKenna predicted, in the psychedelic future, artists will rule because the world will be made of art. And this has come true, but in quite a sad sense. We fact-check everything to ensure it's not fiction, but the narratives we believe are the ones that are given the most airtime and told with the most artistic, and by this I mean subliminal and penetrating storytelling techniques. Alain de Botton, in his user's manual, explains that it's much more commonplace to be taught to decode the plot of Othello than the front page of the New York Times. And he's right. With the news, we switch off the academic critique, the capacity for literary analysis that we're taught to apply to art, which must stay in its clearly demarcated art container. It doesn't matter that it's everywhere, like Terence McKenna predicted. This parallels the way our relationship to receiving information has changed, and in how the media shapes your world, anthropologist and cultural historian Thomas de Zengotitia discusses this in relation to the evolution of kids' bedtime stories. Peter and Wendy. Everyone remembers that one. 1919. Full of jokes at the child's expense for the parent who's reading the story aloud. Children are young and gay and innocent and heartless. The text is very self-aware of being a physical object in a parent's hand while they go through the motions, the theatrics of reading it. And then by the 1940s, we have texts like Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown, where the parent steps into the role of creating a kind of immersive set of bedtime conditions that is just right to fall asleep. Goodnight Moon, Goodnight House. It encourages you to forget that you're listening to a story and to just inhabit the world it creates without thinking critically about it being a story, and to just drift off to sleep in it. And in terms of what we've been trained to do when it comes to media, we've been schooled to stay asleep. What Zengotitia calls being lulled into a state of passive receptivity, essentially fed a series of dispatches on the issues of the day, but because of the dopaminergic feel-good delivery systems with which they come to us, we check for them as a force of habit because we want the hit. In the processing of experiences occasioned by consuming psychedelics, it is standard practice among psychonauts to question their veridicality, a word that Peter Schuster-Hughes uses in his 2022 book, Modes of Sentience. In contrast, when it comes to the widespread public consumption of media, we classically are encouraged to suspend our disbelief when the employment of similarly circumspect critical thinking would in fact be equally warranted. And this is why the broadcast word is so easily used as what Josef Pepier describes as an instrument of power, likening broadcast language directly to a drug in the sense of instigating an alternate reality. Principally, in terms of what's going on, in very, very layman terms, our dopamine skyrockets when we perceive a hit as imminent. And Charlie Brooker describes this really well in a Guardian article from 2010, which is about media hysteria around methadone causing it to become illegal, rather than the methadone itself being the most dangerous drug in the article. And as sociologists predicted, this hype that led to the ban did make it more dangerous. It became adulterated, it had to be purchased on the illicit market, and an unforeseen consequence found by Professor Sheila Bird of Cambridge University was that cocaine deaths went up, because people who'd been buying methadone for purity and convenience went back to cocaine with a reduced tolerance, and this factored into the fatalities. So at its most stark, what hangs in the balance when media influences attitudes to drugs and vice versa, and this interrelation is unchecked, is human lives. And in 2024, again, the UK had the highest levels of drug-related deaths in Europe. Unless this figure magically reduces to zero in the next round of ONS data, it's going to continue to be worth exploring whether more sophisticated media strategies, i.e. ones that don't inadvertently drive other forms of drug use, could be part of a solution. When we think about the fact that these are people, it starts to seem absurd that drug policy discourse uses language that's so unilaterally faceless that discusses both substances' effects and addiction in general in such abstract terms. In mainstream media, people are dehumanized as zombies, as junkies, or identified by their substance of choice, heroin user, while policy rhetoric is perversely depersonalized: budgets, policing initiatives, population statistics, name-checked local organizational bodies, treatment phenomena, all in the passive voice. And this propensity for unpopulated abstract writing bleeds into public information on addiction too, and is a hangover from when prevention was the UK's primary and sole approach to drug use, when it was assumed to be morally wrong, in the words of harm reduction Russell Newcomb, because it is illegal and/or because it is unhealthy. We're yet to investigate the full extent of the cultural damage that decades spent writing drug policy and teaching society about addiction with such a negligible cultivation of a sense of personal involvement has wrought. But while we delay on reviving addiction rhetoric and national drug education literature, its wording remains actively designed not to inspire your further inquiry about taking the substance you're reading, nor to make you look beyond the identikit experience it portrays and think about what you might expect personally, somatically, neurologically, or otherwise. As Jenny Valentish points out in Women of Substances, most medications and other drugs and most treatment programs are tested on, and the latter are designed for, neurotypical men. Where does that leave anybody else reading official guidance who's looking to predict their particular response to a substance in terms of their individual neurotype, current health of the gut microbiome, personal background stressors? It's a good time to mention that I've just started to take the Anaya Psychedelic Mentorship Training course, which is led by Weifeng Zhang, who we heard from a moment ago, and also by Dr. Simon Ruffel. And the first session that this course features goes through some really thorough grounding in terms of the basic neuroscientific principles and current thinking that's going on in clinical psychedelic research, presented by Dr. Holly Wilson. And she clarifies that we all have a different starting point when we come to psychedelics, different density of neurons with different binding potentials, and this can result in different experiences. For example, we see this with people with different profiles, different neuronal profiles, that is, hitting different levels of mystical experience when this is measured in a subjective mystical experience questionnaire. And this feeds into a sense that, in terms of helping us cultivate a personal understanding of our addictive potential, it is clear that this oversimplified, one-size-fits-all, depersonalized linguistic trip we've been taken on when it comes to what we can expect drugs we take to do is a trap. What I mean is, more deeply, is that the fact that alcohol is marketed for celebrating in all sorts of cleverly differentiated contexts and not for making you feel a bit dehydrated or sleepy, and ADHD medications are billed as focus enhancers and not a direct line to insomnia or nervous system overactivation, unless you're given a text which is actually anti the given substance. Can there ever really be such a thing as material on substances which doesn't slant the viewer towards or away from taking them with a particular angle? It's a question I keep thinking about. In the making of this talk, I have been guilty of plastic language. I asked Dr. Z, the inventor of methadone, for his take on the relationship between media and drugs, and the gut microbiome, which I'm so happy to know more about now, is something which features quite a lot in my exchange and my learning with him. It's also something which was covered in the first week of the Anaya Psychedelic Mentorship Training in a really comprehensive tutorial called Psychedelics in the Gut-Brain Axis by Georgia Kaspani. But I started off by asking Dr. Z, can we metabolize media in a way that matches the sophistication with which it's produced? And he clarified, if we read something that gets us excited, it's quite likely that adrenaline or noradrenaline is being released somewhere in our brain. These catecholamines are oxidized by MAOs and are transported to the glial cells adjacent to the presynaptic neuron. This is real metabolism. Instead of taking you to mean this, I believe you're speaking metaphorically, and you are saying if only it would become possible to integrate media matching the sophistication with which it is produced. Am I right? Yes, I had been using the word metabolize in an entirely plastic way, as a metaphorical shorthand for mental digestion, how we construct, interpret, process, and hopefully and potentially eject or metaphorically excrete the elements of media we consume that will make us feel worse and lead to us doing things that will make us feel worse. The term I was after was actually a psychological term, integration. Back to Dr. Z. Okay, so you're wondering if it's possible to integrate media with the same sophistication as which it's produced. I believe it is. Nowhere is this sophistication more poignant than in the trawling of the transcripts of broadcast shows, including the news, by things like IBM's sentiment algorithm and the matching that up with the viewership rankings. So they will prefer themes and wordings that get more eyeballs. This is an univariate optimization. It does not take into account the quality of the attention that it commands, only the quantity. For us to overcome that, we need to create a habit of self-monitoring our reaction to different types of media and then selecting accordingly. As individuals, we would bias our choices towards those sources that make us feel good. Where is the media bias? Whereas for media, their producers, their bias is towards content that commands more attention, regardless of how it makes consumers feel. And so then I asked him about his personal process with this. I can tell you from experience. I spent 34 years in Israel as an adult that is fluent in Hebrew. I'm sure you know that Israel is a country in which the day-to-day is political to the extreme, and as an individual, I could say that if you're oblivious to the media, you feel like a traitor. But I noticed that consuming the news made me feel like shit, so I stopped. I started limiting my consumption to carefully selected sources that were chosen, subject to introspection. Amazingly, I did not become any less informed of current events because when they're important enough, everyone's talking about them. But you know, as an inventor of psychoactives, I'm particularly attuned to the question of who's in charge. I ask this question about any and all cravings and habits. What I'm curious about is, what if there was a way to make more conscious this discriminatory process so that we could not just engage in, but better cultivate our ability to do it subconsciously, spontaneously, when it comes to not going on some of the rides that media is designed to incite us to buckle up for without realizing. And it's in a cornerstone of psychedelic phenomenology that I found a possible approach to this. And I make no apology for reliance on metaphysics and metaphor that this all rides on. La purga, as it's called in Spanish, speaking ayahuasca traditions, the purge. It's something that happens with the ingestion of iboga, with peyote, it can happen with psilocybin. Not only is it a relatively unifying possible feature of encountering sacred plant medicines, but it's intrinsically metaphysical. It's unilaterally agreed to be about letting go of energies that need to be released. And with their release, people who purge stop experiencing both mental and physical traumas they may have been carrying. It's a predominantly physical activity that corresponds to resolution of problems with no obvious ties to the physical realm in which it's taking place. And with research like Simon Raffles' PhD, which you can read in full on the NI website, this phenomenon is being languaged in clinical contexts, becoming part of what people who haven't grown up in a culture where this typically happens can then begin to conceptualize as possible. The physical side of this unarguably energetic process is interesting to consider in the context of iboga too. That's Ryan Genigo-Rich, who trained in Misoko Bwiti, one of the oldest forms and the one that's directly associated with healing, and he leads the Basso Root Church in the United States. Despite the very light diet people have on the day of eating iboga, there can be this particular dark, tarry residue left in the bucket that only ever comes when someone's purged a really important thing to let go of, or acknowledged a really hard truth, suppressed something that they've been struggling with for ages. Sorry, desuppressed something they've been suppressing for ages. In terms of really big things to let go of, a few years ago, Ryan facilitated a ceremony for someone whose experience of purging actually involved purging his traumatic brain injury from sports. And he's just visited Basse-Route again, and he's since become a pilot. Definitely the kind of pilot that, in the spirit of The Little Prince, understands about seeing being more than just what's ostensibly there. What we consciously go in for, we're perhaps more likely to subconsciously do. So it's in the spirit of La Purga that I would like to end with a little Kyriolexy. I'd like to introduce a dragon called Era from Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, which was first published in 1590. And this emblematizes such a embarrassing East-West cultural contrast. In Asian cultures, dragons can be terrifying, but they're also venerated. They are beings of splendor, symbols of transcendentalism. And while this dragon offers us exactly this kind of transmutative potential, as we'll get to in a moment, she's also a caricature of, quite simply, everything Tudor England didn't like. And now, for quite utilitarian purposes, we're going to meet her at her death. Therewith she spewed out of her filthy maw a flood of poison, horrible and black, full of great lumps of flesh and gobbets raw, which stunk so vilely that it forced him back. His grasping hold and from her turn him back. Her vomit, full of books and papers was, with loathly frogs and toads, which eyes did lack, and creeping sought way in the weedy grass, her filthy parbeak all the place defiled has. What the dragon is vomiting up here in this paean to Elizabeth I is what Spenser considers to be Catholic propaganda. So it is this idea that you can have an emetic for your media consumption, very much in the spirit of the fact that what we may not have skillfully integrated, what we may have been too quick to metabolize, we can retrospectively throw up. And in the spirit of this, I would like to offer around a metaphysical emetic. So I have here some blank vomit. And this, if you can just pass it along, take one, fill it in, put it back, is for any media-wrought conceptualizations about drugs, addiction, altered states of consciousness, anything else that feeds poignantly currently into your human experience that you have found yourself rejecting over the course of your research, over the course of your engagement with these topics. And perhaps we can use those to feed into the discussion. I'm very excited by how many people here are studying addiction and stigma and the ways these things interrelate. So I can't wait to hear more from all of you on that in a moment. But this puke bucket, this ubiquitous feature of psychedelic ceremony, we're just going to appropriate it now for psychic rather than a psychedelic context in the hope that this feeds into our media consumption in general. It's time that our dragons, wherever they be, it is time that our dragons flew free.
Thank you so much, Ros. Give up again for Ros. That was awesome. So, Ros, as usual, I'm bursting with questions for you. I'm going to ask two and then give it to the floor. We have about 40 minutes for questions. Is that right, Irini? Yeah, okay, cool. So I'm going to ask two, one about language and one about unlanguaging. I really loved what you were saying about forgetting you're being told a story and immersing yourself into it as both a kind of it could be a sinister thing and it can be a positive thing, especially in Charlie Brooker's article about how media articles about Meow Meow are more dangerous even than Meow Meow in some way. And then what Holly Wilson was saying about having different starting points. So with that question of metabolizing media, can I read you a quick section of this just to illustrate? I know that, so this poet is a poet who is described as someone who slows down the metabolism of language by one of my favorite poets, Rowan Williams. And so if we're slowing down the metabolism of language, is there a way of unpacking that metaphor further? Could you slow down? Like, my question to you is, can we snow down the anabolism and the catabolism of language? So what brings words together and why? What takes them apart and why? Because in phenomenology especially, there's always a difference between the object as it's intended and the object as it comes across. So what you mentioned about the word, what was it, transcendent and ancient well-being modalities, these kind of statements that if you're an expert are absurd, but then come across in a certain way. So yeah, in this poem, for example, you created from a clot, Gabriel isn't coming for you. You too full to eat, too locked to door, too cruel to wander, Gabriel isn't coming. You too loved to love, you too speak to hear, too wet to drink, no Gabriel. You too pride to weep, too play to still, too high to come, no, Gabriel won't be coming for you. Anyway, yeah. Anabolizing and catabolizing media. Can we do that?
For me, that was a very standalone experience, the poem. I might have to dive back into some earlier facets of the question. But I definitely feel like there's an art to crafting media which is interrelated with the minds of the people that are going to be receiving it, which is what I was mostly thinking about when you were asking that question, and this idea that there's this kind of congregation between the linguistic context that a person can bring to the media they encounter and the media itself. So I'm thinking about Alex Aldridge, who's a sex and drugs researcher, and she really needed to make a sign to get across this idea of consent being an important element in a darkroom. So that's how do you make a piece of paper that just communicates that in a place where people aren't going to be able to have conversations about it. There's limited light anyway, you just need a few words. And she just ended up with this piece of paper that said consent is key, which is enough in that context if you're having all of these wraparound conversations going on that mean that it's landing in minds that know the issues, are relating it to various things they understand that to be. And if you're just saying that to someone who doesn't have any kind of educational grounding in any of those topics like nightclub ethics and safe sex and all of the rest of it, then they just get a short message that's fairly meaningless. And so yeah, I feel like considering your audience and then calibrating it to be what they're going to want to hear, which I guess is what our news feeds do as well. The algorithm feeds us things that it thinks we like, and then we think we live in a world where we're just hearing back what we like, so we don't get anyone telling us that we're too wet to drink most of the time, which I think is partly why it can be so abrasive to come up against a full-on here's something that I'm just saying to you whether you like it or not, because so often that's not how things are parsed. It might also be why people ignore signs. Can't remember who pointed it out, but it was in a conversation about signage breaking convention, I think, and this idea of communicating to people being much better, because there's something about seeing a sign that just makes you switch off and not read it. And I wonder if that is the language that they're calibrated in, not being sufficiently calculated in most contexts to reach most people.
Thank you. I'll ask your consent next time I read you a poem. I do think that consent is an interesting one because it's nuanced. It's nuanced so much in the last 10 years, and people, it's a real trigger for some people. But the whole discourse around it has become so much more necessarily complex, and therefore it means different things to different people for sure. Its intention is not always how it's received. So that's a really good example to pick for that. On the question of non-language though, and I guess segueing from that consent discourse, so one of the cultures I study is rave culture, and that's very much about a language-less space. So, and one of the thinkers that I've been kind of grappling with in that question of languagelessness is Steve Goodman, Sonic Warfare, in which he says, Well, he brings together speculations on the not yet heard or unsound of the 21st century, mapping imminent tendencies of the sonic body within the military-industrial complex, noting that low frequency vibration, languageless sound, can be used as a technique for affective mobilization. So this production of vibrational environments per se facilitate the transduction of the tensions of urban existence. So dancing to sounds that your ancestors would have labored under, turning that into a celebratory thing in techno music, for example. So do you think that, what are the ways in which we can talk about not talking, and what's the value of not talking? I ask as a hypocrite. And then we'll go to the floor. Yeah.
A surprising question.
Oh, I thought that was the answer.
There is a friend of ours, Farzad Muhitian, who is a chemistry and well, he's a polymath, and it's very difficult to say exactly what it is that he does, but I think he ostensibly teaches chemistry at NYU. And he once went to his first lecture and he froze. It was the first lecture of the year, and he didn't say anything for an hour. And at the end, everyone was like, that was amazing. And so now he does it every year. And I think the value for me, if I was attending that class, would be that when something completely different happens, you pay attention, and everyone competes for our attention all the time. So in fact, the easiest way perhaps to get it is not to speak when it's the moment to do so.
Thank you so much. Yeah, attention is the rarest form of generosity, but something very right. I think that really like resonates always with me with that, because I struggle.
Something I was pointed out to me recently in a writing group that I was at is that silent is an anagram of listen.
Nice. So we're going to just trade words now. Hands up. Anyone really look forward to the discussion now. Achilles, I saw you first, and then we have you. Do you have a question at the back? No. No. Okay. Well, they will arrive. Achilles first, then.
First of all, thank you so much, Rose. That was a really fascinating presentation. Now, my question is trying to juxtapose addiction to drugs, in general, kind of like medicinal substances, and media. Now, I would say that we tend to get addicted to drugs that are euphoric, right? However, research has shown that we tend to consume media a lot more and a lot more kind of like compulsively when it's extremely negative. And I would say this is actually dysphoric. How do you see this happening? And do you think if we treat addiction as a sort of like ailment of sorts, do you think that it would complicate the treatment of addiction to media compared to addiction to substances?
It's the same chemical release, isn't it?
I think the dopamine is
It's being addicted to the same chemical that's been released in your brain, whether that be from media or the drug.
Yeah, but we tend to, even if we accept this, which I do accept, kind of like we tend to release more dopamine for negative media then, because we tend to get addicted more to them.
I think there's several things going on there. So there is definitely the dopamine, but I think we also like righteous indignation more than we necessarily would admit to ourselves. And it's really interesting, if you've ever done a Myers-Briggs test by yourself versus with a friend watching over your shoulder, you represent yourself completely differently some of the time if you think that you are like being the version of yourself that you want someone else to see you as versus the true you. And I think there's a habit forming property to media, which my personal experience of giving up everything with the help of the plants was that Instagram was the one that managed to kind of sidle through, and I was able to give up all sorts of like patterns in terms of how I was living, in terms of what substances I was drawn to, in terms of how I worked, in terms of how I ate and exercised. But Instagram was the one with the hook, and that's not because it makes me feel good, it's because we go back to what we know. In my personal experience, I would really love to hear more from anyone who is studying this, to add to that if anyone wants to add in.
Do we have any more questions? Hands up. Oh yeah, the back. Nice.
I just wanted to ask a question.
What's your name?
Grace.
Louise, welcome.
Can you just please summarize your argument to someone who doesn't know anything about psychedelics like me?
Absolutely. Everyone thinks their own personal thoughts about psychedelics, but we have this media machine which at the moment is screaming at us that psychedelics will fix all our problems. And it's really, really important to assess that information in relation to knowing yourself really, really well, like your neurotype, how you respond typically to different situations. Otherwise, you're having all of these drugs marketed at you for particular reasons, and you're going to be taking them thinking, oh, maybe I'll microdose and I'll be more productive. Or maybe you'll microdose and you'll put up with a really, really difficult situation for longer than you should do because you're able to be distracted. You never know how the things that are being recommended in particular ways are going to play into what you've actually personally got going on. And so it's really, really well worth just being extremely skeptical. And because media is Moorish, it can be very easy to get sucked into having it shape our minds in ways that make us feel depressed in a way that makes us reach for a drink, or anxious in a way that makes us need melatonin or Valium. And then our drug use starts to coalesce with our media use. So it's just worth paying really, really close attention to how you feel on any substance you might be drawn to, and also really close attention to why you're drawn to it and whether that context is real.
Great summary, Ross. Thank you.
So I'd love to just like sort of add a
Pay your attention, they say in the Native American church.
I'd like to add on to sort of just like what you were saying about like the rave culture and sort of tones within, just sort of to add to that like vibrational frequency and how that affects sort of just like your emotional reaction and response in the moment, and that chemical response to like your neuroplasticity. So maybe due to your past experiences and your subconscious coming from that, but possibly I was just saying, obviously each syllable, every letter you do, like whatever, that has its own vibrational frequency that it gives and what tone that you say. So like if you shout at a dog, if you shouted at a dog but said kind words to it, but it's also like been, it reacts, it takes it in that way. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on how in what tone or manner you speak to someone, and how vibrational frequency could possibly affect the chemical response and release in your brain to how you think and feel in a conversation.
That's a really interesting question. It makes me think straight away of this book called Unbound by Kasia Urbaniak, and she was a dominatrix in order to fund her, I think she still is, but she wanted to become a Taoist nun, so she was a really, really highly paid dominatrix in order to fund her nun studies. And so she had this really interesting cross-section of learning all about how to make people feel comfortable to give up their power, which is all people who come to a dominatrix want to do, is they want to be told what to do. They want a time where they're not in the driving seat of their life. And then in her Taoist nun studies, she needed to be able to just, with the least amount of energy, change the situation. And the person that she found most helpful that she spoke to for both of these worlds was a dog trainer. And it was precisely this thing of being able to modulate the way you say what you say so that it starts to matter less what it is that you're saying.
I remember when I was working in Hamleys as a toy demonstrator, I was getting so depressed, I'd scream at Christmas time, "Merry capitalism! Everyone come buy your children happiness." I was saying it in a really happy way, and people were coming to buy loads. Like, even though what I was saying was not good, but I was happy. I was at least pretending to be like, and it was the tone, it's the medium. You know, it's a McLuhan, isn't it? The medium message. Yeah.
Yeah, use like frequency and tone to in the moment to even being delusional. Use frequency and tone to flip your energy and frequency.
For sure. I mean, singing and mood raising. We have a question.
Exactly. Yeah.
We have a question there. What's your name? Oh, what's your name? Sorry.
Sorry, I'm Declan.
Declan, nice to meet you. Welcome.
Nice to meet you.
And
Hey, I'm Molly.
Molly, well, please
Hi.
ask your question.
Thank you. So it's seen like the media saying drugs are super dangerous, like this thing about Miami, right? And then also this, oh, psychedelics are the magic bullet that are going to save everyone's lives. What messaging or like core beliefs would you like to see being portrayed by the media regarding plant medicines or routes of exploring altered states of consciousness? And what do you think would be the healthy medium if perhaps these are two extremes?
I think it would be really cool to hear more from the plants.
Yeah.
So for instance, in Bwiti, there's a lot of stuff that isn't going to be in mainstream media discourse because Bwiti is an oral tradition. And so the way to share that information is around the fireside in what they call a fire talk. So you come to the fire circle and that's where you receive the teachings. And then there's a lot of activism around like, let's make sure that various Bwiti groups have a presence on social media by kind, misguided people that maybe haven't thought maybe we should look at whether social media is perhaps a toxic context that none of this needs to be in, rather than trying to put things that have encrypted into their design that they don't want to belong there. And so I think like, I'm not sure what an ayahuasca inspired PR campaign or communication strategy would be, but I did design one for an Iboga retreat center that was around this idea that because the second layer of root bark is where the medicine is, that social media should be kind of like the bare minimum, and it should be to draw people to the internal communications, to the mailing lists where the meat is, in the spirit of having less kind of flashy media. So I think in that spirit, don't try and hypnotize people by making reels that essentially just get them to stay on Instagram. It's a really easy trap to fall into, but when you're making reels, you're being reeled into that being what's going on just as much as the people watching them. And I think that's maybe, it's how we do the things we do, giving people small digestible bits of information to read in their own time. I think more of that and maybe less persuading, less using the tech that's there because it's there, and more thinking like, why am I being nudged to get this update? Why am I being asked to do this? And yeah, I feel like we have such an easy buy-in to so many of these platforms. And yeah, I would say maybe the spirit of the plants to me seems to indicate a buyout.
Can I push you on like what the actual content of that messaging? Like, what would you want people to be exploring media regarding?
More diverse, avoiding the buzzwords at all costs. So much of the time people use the buzzwords because they're the words that they know will make the piece rank higher. And so even if you actually have a really good journalist who's deliberately not used them, you'll get an editor putting in something like cocaine fueled just to put a keyword in that makes the piece do better. And I think if we all just say we don't care about rankings, we're going to language things in our own way, then it won't be as easy to predict what the headlines would be. And I definitely don't want to be part of any efforts to write a hymn sheet. I think that can so often be what happens with drug policy reform, is people are like, let's get everyone singing from the same hymn sheet that we write. And I think it would just be much better if more people talked about things in their own way, rather than thinking I don't have the language for this, and then it would just become less predictable what people would be saying, and I would so welcome that. So I don't have an answer, I think, because I don't want
Yeah.
there to be one.
It sounds like having less of a dictatorial relationship between media and how people perceive.
Oh, for sure. And I think maybe much less stringent stylistic guidelines. Noam Chomsky talks about how you never really need to tell staff journalists that they're going out of line, because there's this thing that happens when you work in a news organization called an internalization of priorities. So everyone just subconsciously takes on the ideals of their news organization, and they'll write pretty much what that news organization ought to say. So you can just rely on them to do their job. There doesn't have to be this kind of like, well, how did you end up saying that? And yeah, I think maybe if we were to make it more okay to go out of line, or change what going out of line means, everything would be more variable, and that would be so much better.
Just before we come to you, sir, we have a question online. And Nikki, great that you're with us. Do you want to ask your question? Do you want to unmute? Maybe show us your face and ask your question, Nikki. Welcome.
Well, I'll give it a go. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. Hi, Ros. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. There was a lot in it, though. I'm not sure if I could keep up with it all.
Thank you so much for coming.
Very rich. So my question was about I'm going to read what I've written because it's phrased how I want it to be. So the phenomenon of media terminology that you mentioned earlier, which creates categories that depersonalize drug users with factual yet unsympathetic labels, like you were saying about like addicts and cocaine users and things like this, could perhaps take an example from how the term slaves has become replaced now by enslaved people, which foregrounds the humanity of those concerned. So perhaps we could start using terms, and again, not in a prescriptive hymn sheety kind of way, but just by general sort of osmosis, start talking about addicted people, people addicted to cocaine, people suffering from addiction, and really making sure that we include the term people, because that's so important to remember and can get lost with what you were, as you were saying earlier, about the sort of, the filthy cocaine fueled drug addict, blah, blah. It's like, it doesn't have that sense of these are people who are often suffering from trauma and abuse in their past, especially their childhood.
I completely agree. And I also think we can't underestimate the effects of just individually changing our language. And if we do all do that, and there are some really good guides, like Harm Reduction International has one. I think there's one on the Transform website as well. All the language and the reasons to use it, as you were describing, that is people-centric, is there to find. And I think it would be a really wonderful thing if it was widespread, that we adopted better, more humane ways of talking about the problems people encounter when we use drugs, and people encountering those problems, and people.
But that's something that we could perhaps like encourage those reporting on breaking convention to start using, or to use this type of language, and again, encourage rather than prescribe.
Oh, for sure. Well, I think with breaking convention, the
They're
risk
probably
is
already
much more that
convinced,
they're
aren't they?
going to be screaming about how everyone needs to take psychedelics for particular reasons, than that they're not going to approve of taking drugs. But I completely agree.
Okay, thank you very much.
Does Drugs and Me offer that kind of language recommendation?
It's been a great many years since I was directly involved in it, but a big part of setting it up was, for sure, and I mean the website's gorgeous, and it is definitely an informational resource where if you're new to psychedelics, if you want to find out various safety profiles of different drugs, it's a great place to go. I think the UK Drug Policy Society, even though it was 2012, still actually has the best guide on how to talk about drugs in relation to reducing stigma. So I'd recommend that over anything else.
UK Drug Policy Society. Okay, thank you. Please, thank you for waiting. Could you introduce yourself again?
Yeah.
Andrew, yeah.
I'm just curious, do you have any reflections on how AI may influence the evolution of language usage or the devolution of language usage?
It is interesting asking AI about things it doesn't quite know about yet. And that's something that I've done a little bit in relation to Iboga. And you get these replies like, how would I write a press release about this? That basically just use the most generalized, most absolute plastic language about psychedelics more widely, which, because Iboga is quite dissimilar in many ways from other psychedelics, it's a really good one to kind of have that as a test of what's AI doing with this material. And it really does foreground the fact that AI is just trying its best with the Lego bricks it has. So I haven't yet encountered it doing anything psychedelic where I've really thought like, wow, this is going to enter the discourse in a way that's going to confuse people or change people. Like, it's more confusing that it thinks it could be convincing in my encounters of it at the moment.
I'd love to add to that. It's like psychedelics would be more of a way to look within rather than and find the power within and what you're capable and resonate with that rather than artificial, because biological and artificial are two completely different things on trajectories going on their separate ways.
Thank you, Declan. Before you respond to that, Ros, we'll get another question. Yes, Steve, and then Amadeus, and then you if there's time, and okay, then Leo. So we'll try. Should we maybe put those questions together because we have 15 minutes? So do you have a notepad, Ros?
I can make one.
Borrow mine. Sorry?
Do I need to draw
I
something?
think because we have 4 questions in 15 minutes, let's do all the questions, let's lump them together. You can draw, you can do whatever media you want with my notepad.
Is that what you've given it to me for?
Yeah.
Cool.
So, yeah, in that order, Steve, Amadeus, yourself, Leo, and yeah, when it comes to you, introduce yourself. Cool.
During your media diet, did you find that some media was more toxic than others? Was it like, oh, Daily Mail, oh, Double Blind magazine?
I had a really weird experience actually with that.
Tell us about that weird experience. Can we go to the next question and jump them together? Just
You want me to write them down?
yeah.
I was just drawing a cat.
I don't. Amadeus, please.
Thank you for a really engaging talk. I'm wondering, are there any journalists who write about drugs, psychedelics, or addiction that you admire and respect?
Yes, Jenny Valendish is an incredible researcher. She wrote a book called Women of Substances and then one a bit more recently called Everything Harder Than Everyone Else. And she really goes deeply into kind of her own personal psychology, how that led her where she went, how she recapitulated back into different forms of finding herself through the treatment systems while looking at all the ways that the treatment systems are not optimized for women. She's in Australia and she actually coaches anyone who is going to be doing interviews with media about how successful their addiction treatment has been and how to not get kind of exploited by the addiction treatment centres and made to be kind of poster children for how good they are at treating people for addiction. So she really kind of looks back at the worlds that she's moved through and uses her journalistic expertise to change the culture for the better. There's another ex-journalist who helped start an organisation called Saipan, Ian Roulier, and together with Leonie Schneider, they represent people who've been through psychedelic clinical trials and then just end up being kind of celebrated for these amazing results that they experienced while they're actually having quite a terrible experience the other side of the fanfare in real life. So he's another person who kind of knows the media intimately and kind of does something really great within it. Ruby Devoy is another one. I first saw her on a panel at a drug industry conference a few years ago, and she was moderating the panel, but she knew more than most of the people on it about cannabis and cannabinoids and CBD and all of the kind of nitty-gritties of the legalization. But she's also someone who focuses really brilliantly on kind of indigenous things that we can, indigenous to the UK ways of being psychedelic, and why we don't need to necessarily be poaching other cultures. And then there's Mather Busby as well. He's a really, really prolific journalist, but he's also a book writer and longer form writer as well. And he is a features writer, so he doesn't tend to do the issues of the day. He tends to find people that just are kind of using drugs in interesting ways and kind of burrow into the subculture of what they're doing. And I think also it would be so remiss not to mention Max Daly, who is the global drugs editor of Vice, but I first met him years ago when he was just the absolute most dedicated person to going really, really hard into the middle of the story. He'd learn languages and be up at 5 in the morning talking to the relevant people to put a story together for days and days on end. He was one of the first people that I met when I was kind of coming into this world who was as obsessed with writing about drugs and the nuances of drugs as I was becoming, and was a really, really inspirational figure when I was starting out. And he's now the global drugs editor of Vice, which I don't actually know if Vice is still as operational as it was, but he's an incredible journalist. So yeah, that's
Thanks,
it.
Ross. Could you tell Stephen your story? Sorry, I cut you short, and then we'll have the 2 questions. We've got 10 minutes. So do you remember what the story
Yes.
was? Yeah. And then we'll have 2 final questions. Yeah.
Finding magazines in the woods.
So I went on a meditation retreat, and I don't really know why anyone calls these things retreats, because you're very much going into something that, it would be wonderful to be able to just retreat into a newsagent or a bus from a lot of the time. But what I found was when I was left with my psyche, the technique was as Vipassana. So the idea is to keep kind of batting your consciousness away, try and focus on the exercises they give you. So you're not really meant to just have your thoughts unfurling, but obviously they come again and again and again. And what I found after a bit was that I'd kind of start to mediatize them. So it would be like, that's a Daily Mail type of thought. Ooh, that was a clever one. That was a Telegraph kind of thought. Soap opera, and I just had all of these different kind of daytime TV, teenage magazine, like enemy style thoughts just appearing from different angles depending what they were trying to tell me. But it was a deeply mediatized experience, and yeah, I think that just made me realize quite how ingrained that way of engaging with the world is. And there was a 70-day option, but that felt a bit too hardcore at the time, and I don't know if that would have been what would have got rid of it completely.
Tone and style guides for certain.
Yeah,
Very much. You're quite right, by the way. The media is a advertising vector more than anything else. Yeah.
Could you introduce yourself? Give us a snappy question, and then Leo also as snappy as possible, and then Ros, if you could answer both of those in one fell sentence. No, I mean, if you want to experiment with language like that. Yeah, we have time. We have time to go into these questions. Yeah, we've got like 7 minutes. So yeah.
I'm Matt. I probably don't really need to ask this question because probably find this out through my own research, but I don't know an awful lot about iboga. It's quite an unusual substance to be consuming. So I'd love to know more about that, but that's probably not best to ask now.
It's a really good question.
Yeah. More about iboga, and Leo? You can answer. Yeah, do you want to answer now? Okay, all right.
There is a reason that we're not culturally, with several reasons that we're not kind of culturally acclimatized to iboga in the way we are to other psychedelic substances. The first is that it only became, so there's iboga and there's ibogaine. Ibogaine is just one isolated alkaloid of the whole plant. Iboga has a tradition of use around it called the Bwiti tradition, which originates in Gabon and goes back millennia. And people think it's the oldest religion and kind of oldest plant medicine usage that there is. It only actually was the last couple of decades that many forms of wheatie, it was decided in the villages over there that they would share them with the world. So there has been a big explosion in people being invited to Gabon to train, empowered to serve wheatie, empowered to pass on the tradition. It's a slow growing tradition because it's an oral tradition, so you can't just find out what to do to hold a ceremony on the internet. You have to go, you have to sit around the fire. It's a really long process that there's no way to speed up, because also part of the training involves particular things going on in other planes than this one that you just have to wait for. There's all sorts of cultural reasons to do with that, why it's not mediatized in the same way, it's not advertised. There until the last kind of few years, there haven't been people going, come and do an iboga retreat, because this kind of westernized form of it hasn't existed in the same way. But also because both ibogaine and iboga are primarily used in Western culture still to interrupt what we call addiction. So the biggest synchrony is between opiate addiction and ibogaine. And Howard Lotsoff was a student who was addicted to heroin. He was doing a drug testing voluntary thing, and someone said, oh, you might like this, and gave him some drugs that had been left behind. And that was what turned out to be ibogaine. And a few days later, he just realized, oh, I haven't felt like taking heroin. And he gave some to his girlfriend. And she was like, oh, yeah, I just seem to have stopped too. And so he'd suddenly been handed this baton where he was able to start giving this substance to people and like creating what essentially became the Western uptake of people taking ibogaine for opiate addiction. So to anyone who's not in that realm, it definitely, like opiate addiction itself, I think has been tarred with this PR sense of like, oh, well, that's a thing that doesn't really concern me, and that's a thing that people that need that do. And that means that it's only really recently that people have started to engage kind of more widely. Have been iboga tracks at Breaking Convention the last two, and ibogaine tracks at Breaking Convention the last couple of years, but it didn't always have this kind of ubiquitous presence in the psychedelic circuit the same way as the others. So yeah, that's a little bit about it and kind of why it hides or has been hidden.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive summary for people who don't know about iboga, Ros. Lior, one question, and that will be our final question for the day. But it's the golden hour, and the Imperial is calling most of us. So there is time for more chat. Lior.
Do you think psychedelics are a form of media?
What was the question, sorry?
Do you think psychedelics are a form of media?
Such a good question. I was really tempted to just give a silent answer.
Let's think about the pub.
I want other people's answers to that question too. The only tiny thing I will say on that, in iboga, there's not this thing of if you share your visions, you'll lose your visions. You can talk about whatever you want. At one point, I asked the medicine, if I'm not going to be taking various things anymore, what am I going to do instead? And I was hit by this flood of mushrooms. It was like Piccadilly Circus screens of advertising mushrooms everywhere. Like it was the biggest product placement for mushrooms you could possibly imagine. So yeah, that was this kind of trans drug advertising experience that very, very much felt like media.
Amazing. What a lovely note to end on. Should we all give Ros a very warm... Awesome.
Yay.
No, thank you so much for coming, everyone. 2 weeks today is the next one. the next week.
So much, everyone. So lovely to see you.
18th of October for our next colloquium. See you there. Great questions.
So welcome.